Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us. The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is happy to announce that we have won 2 Garden Communicator International Silver Laurel Medal Awards for Best Podcast and Best Podcast Episode. We've also won a Garden Communicators International Gold Laurel Medal Award for a Best Podcast Episode. We'd like to thank Garden Communicators for their recognition.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA-certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones, unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. This podcast is being recorded on October 25th, 2024. As Resiliency Planting Coordinator with the Climate Forestry and Carbon Unit at New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, J.J. Käthe is seeking input from agencies and organizations across the state on the New York State Reforestation Plan. The plan will act as a roadmap to achieving the Climate Act Scoping Plan goal of establishing 1.7 million acres of new forest by 2040. JJ has experience working in invasive species management, greenhouse operations, volunteer coordination, data processing, and emergency preparedness from work at nonprofit organizations in the private sector and at the Department of Environmental Conservation. She holds a BA and an MS degrees in geography from the State University of New York System, SUNY for short, New Paltz, and SUNY Albany. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, JJ. We're delighted that you could be with us today.
Yeah, good morning. Excited to chat.
So I was really interested in the presentations you were doing in the course that we were taking with you, and I thought that I would ask you at the onset as to how you wound up in your position now with the New York State Forestry Organization.
So, I work right now for New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and Division of Lands and Forests. Had a pretty chaotic trajectory that I'm not sure many folks have sort of traveled the same route, but I think it's really good for the position I ended up in. So my background, I guess, educationally is I have a bachelor's and a master's in geography. And then even going before that, I worked in greenhouse management here and there, like landscaping, that sort of thing. And then after school, I still liked that sort of work. And I ended up in invasive species management for terrestrial plants and then for forest pests. So that really shows you the sickly and, more degraded sides of ecosystems, which is disheartening, but it's really fun to get out there and try to physically on the ground, make an impact in those systems across the state. So I started there and then had a few, as we all do, sort of intermixed side gigs of working in farming and on boats on the Hudson River and in environmental education and volunteer coordination and trail building and all kinds of stuff. Right now, my position is called resiliency planting coordinator. And, I'm sure I'll talk your guys' ears off about it, but I'm coordinating the statewide reforestation plan. And I just remember when I got hired, my supervisor told me, we think you'd be a good fit for this position because of your work with volunteers and the public. Like volunteers in the public. I thought it would be right because of my forestry related sort of degrees, my environmental science background. But it turns out that my role really is less the role of a forester and more the role of a coordinator. So it's really fun. So I'm talking to all kinds of people in all these different sectors and fields that touch reforestation. And I think I have like sort of a little bit of background on what each of them are sort of what each of them are contributing. So yeah, I'm like a JJ of all trades at this point. It's a good time.
I think it's really fascinating because most people don't realize how important social skills are. And I was listening to the radio this morning on National Public Radio, and they were talking about one of the things that people really are concerned with in their new jobs is to be trained on how to speak with others. Because it's something that we neglect and we're not as courteous as we used to be. That was something that we learned when we were in school years ago, but the communication's so different. And because we use all of our computers and cell phones and we're texting all the time, that a lot of times in the course of a day, we're really not talking to anybody. We're just talking to a machine. And so that interaction is critical for building communities like tree communities.
The internet made us mean.
Oh, it made us very mean.
I used to be nice, and then the internet came along, and now I'm a grouch.
I don't believe it.
So I have a question, JJ. I was going to wait towards the end, but you mentioned your work with invasives, and I'm wondering, when you go for a hike in the woods, are you able to turn it off in terms of inventorying the invasives, and can you still enjoy yourself?
Well, I was going to say, no, I can't turn it off, but yes, I can still enjoy myself. And that's been a long time coming. My friends, not so much. It's funny walking in the woods with people who aren't in forest health or aren't in the field. I'm like, wow, it's so lush and green. And then I just sort of get quiet and they're like, is that harmful? And I'm like, yeah, it sure is, Yeah. But it's, there are areas that like New York is a big state. We have a lot of beautiful, diverse ecosystems with all different land use histories and uses and ecological communities and cultural communities, So there are a lot of beautiful things in the state. And then the other part of it too is that the invasives and these sort of new sort of degraded environments are so commonplace and so widespread that at one point it's helpful to just sort of realize, hey, this is what we're working with, and It's better than a shopping mall. If you're on a trail and it's all covered in bittersweet and barberry, then like, all right, that's our starting point, So.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting that you're pointing that out, because when you said that your friends say it's green, I think that that's the key, that people see the green and they feel relaxed right away. Their blood pressure goes down. They're feeling more joyful. They're more talkative. They seem to be happier. And it doesn't make a difference what kind of green it is. It's green. And that's what I think is what people see. First things first, right? Those of us who are educated in the invasive problem, it's there. It's there.
And a lot of it is really not intuitive too. It's like we talk all the time about how there's like the public perception of, what a healthy ecosystem looks like. And a lot of the times, if it's lush and green, like I said, you might be looking at a bunch of vines covering, trees that are now dead. And that can be misleading. Or like, we always talk about forest management and how, based on our land use history in New York State, we have a lot of like newer growth forests that require a lot of like cutting and management. Or, I spent all this time in the field with a brush cutter cutting down those invasive shrubs. And that looked really bad. That didn't look like, a nice like walk in the forest. There's like stumps everywhere. But that can actually be, a really good sign too. Like that can be what the forest needs. So it's not intuitive, with everything that we have going on in our lives. It's like not fair to expect a landowner or a hiker to understand the nuance there. So one of the things on my plate is, I guess, to try to make that a little easier to grasp for people who are just getting into it. Because, not obvious.
Yeah, the Morris Arboretum last week hosted the Canopy Conference, and to your point about invasives, a nice, comfortable debate breaking out about Bradford pear. And I mean, it'll be an argument that'll go on forever. And the argument being, out here in a beautiful suburb, college campus, maybe no pears, but bring it into the low income neighborhood that is screaming for canopy. It's a pretty great tree. JJ, I wanted to ask you how you use the word resiliency. So it's part of your job title, and I have a feeling you're speaking to groups of people about it on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that I am sometimes called, like reforestation coordinator here, but I like to fall back on the fact that I have that beautiful word in my title. So so like the thing we're looking for is, I guess I would differentiate resilience from, well, for example, from reforestation. Like if really I was just in charge of reforestation, or somebody who was in charge of implementation of reforestation, we could do, I'm sure you guys have heard plenty of this, like, you could just go out, do the planting and kind of walk away, and great, like you did, you completed those projects. But building resilience is this long-term, sort of like holistic network building, ecologically, landscape-wise, and socially, So I think resilience has a lot more moving parts, a lot more flexibility, and it just calls more to that sort of like adaptability. So we talk all the time about the difference between climate mitigation and adaptation. And so we have like the reforestation plan for the state that sort of coordinating, I'm sure we'll talk about the goals, but its main goal is at carbon sequestration. And so that's just, let's get as many acres of forest as we can out there to start slurping up this carbon so we can make our climate change situation less bad to deal with, right? And then the other side of that is climate adaptation. And that's sort of, the situation is what it is, but we need to now change, how we're going to respond to climate change impacts. So you mentioned like, maybe there's a neighborhood where the only thing you can get to grow, in the tree pit in the middle of the sidewalk is a kind of like non-native tree that like not everybody loves, but that's going to be really key to adaptation, because it's going to, provide those benefits of cooling if you're in an urban heat island, or, storing some stormwater during severe weather events and things like that. So that's more the adaptation side. And when you're looking at the whole picture of resiliency, it's kind of cool that you can look at that entire spectrum of practices and changes instead of just focusing on emissions or just focusing on the sort of end product of how people experience climate change and adapt to it. It's like everything. So yeah, we love a nice broad, positive sounding sort of direction forward of like, we're going to build resilience. It's nice to refer to that and have people know what I mean.
The word resilient, are you also thinking it's broad, but it also is very deep too, isn't it? It's lots of layers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When I think of resiliency, I think of maybe like mycorrhiza or a thick layer of leaves on the ground. Or if I was making a cake, it would be the whole cake, the icing and the in-betweens and everything else that resiliency can create for the person who doesn't understand, when you're talking about it. And I really like the way you explain that, because you're talking broadly, but you're also talking deeply. When we think of, sustainability, it's the word just to sustain what's already there. It doesn't mean to make it better. Right. But resiliency does incorporate that, even though you may not think it does, but it does. Resiliency means that you have to make it better in order for it to continue on. So I think that's really fabulous. I like the name of your title.
Thank you. Yeah, me as well.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at it also through the eyes of an arborist and, the attention and focus that the amenity tree gets. Like right now here in the Delaware Valley, Greater Philadelphia, 4 counties, we're looking at a fairly serious drought condition.
Yeah.
So when I walk in the woods, it's a downer right now. It's like, let it go, accept this. These trees have been here through this before. Tulip trees, beech, everything looks pretty awful. And so I bring that back to resiliency as like, this ecosystem has what it takes to leaf back out in the spring. Along those lines, there are some pretty ambitious goals. I'm looking at, I guess, New York State's Climate Action Council and that net zero emissions by 2050, 2050. That's close.
Yeah. Ambitious is the name of the game.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. There's a lot there to sort of like demystify. So, and figuring out how trees fit into that whole, like, right, we were saying the picture of resilience is, I'm thinking the the resilience of a forest system, but it's really the resilience of, all these fields and sectors that interact with land use and sustainability and emissions. So the Climate Act of 2019 set that net zero goal, and that was mostly aimed at the energy sector. So it's more of that mitigation. Let's try to, reduce our emissions. And so that's going to involve scaling up of renewable energy at, a totally like unprecedented pace and everything. Yeah. And then sort of as a separate component to that, there's sort of like an implicit goal within the Climate Act that says that about 15% of New York State's emissions are going to be locked into difficult to decarbonize sectors. And those we should account for by somehow increasing carbon sequestration. And so the best thing to do for carbon sequestration is forest establishment. So when my agency came up with the CLCPA, the Climate Act scoping plan, then the way that they decided to handle that was to have a call to create a reforestation plan. And that was the impetus for me being hired. So that scoping plan came out in 2022, I believe. And that was what set the 1.7 million acre goal that we were working with for not only tree planting, but for all the practices that, we could imagine relating to reforestation. That could be controlling competing vegetation or managing deer browse or anything that can improve forest regeneration. And then, planting goes along with that. So we have this 1.7 million acre goal. And that number came from a few land assessments looking at reforestation opportunity, saying here's probably the max of, acreage that we could plant up. Yeah, and specifically the metric that they look at for that is something like abandoned ag land, even though we're probably going to plant up a lot more than that. And maybe we're not going to plant up all the abandoned ag land because some of it is, laying fallow on purpose in rotation, things like that. But so that was like a really rough estimate that we said, let's shoot for 1.7 million acres. And I always, when I see people turn green, when I say that number, I say, well, everybody has that friend that like, you need them to be there at 5, so you tell them to be there at 4 sort of thing.
I wondered about that.
It's huge. It's, looking into it a little more, it's like a little over the size of Delaware, or I like to say 2 Rhode Islands and change. It's a huge acreage, but, the point is less. I tried to, when I talk to stakeholders and partners, I try to sort of steer them away from how scary those big numbers are for anything climate legislation, and just say, all right, let's choose inaction or action. Like, let's just get something rolling. So we have the 1.7 million acres. I start planning, what strategies we would even look at to dream of starting on something like that about a year ago when I came on. And then in January of this year, the governor made her State of the State announcement, and it ended up being tree related, but it wasn't quite our acreage goal that we expressed in the scoping plan. It was plant 25 million trees by 2033. So, we were elated to hear that trees were involved in the State of the State announcement, but it is a little different, right? And, we just talked about how you have the mitigation side, like just get the trees out there so they can start sequestering. Yeah. And then you have the adaptation side. And, when Governor Hochul was describing the intent of 25 million trees, that really was, let's engage youth and talk to communities about why trees are important. Let's get trees into disadvantaged and underserved communities and create a market for reforestation and tree planting more broadly. So we have these two things that sort of like overlap and reinforce each other, but they're a little different. And 25 million trees is also, when I start to represent that goal, over the past year that's been out, people respond like, are you crazy? 1.7 million acres, 25 million trees, but everything's going to be a jumping off point. I keep finding myself saying like the goal is to build a reforestation machine, like effectively build this pipeline so that we can start increasing at all and then see where we go from there. It's about the journey, not the destination.
Yeah.
If your job was kind of created just a year ago, right? And I was listening to some statistics that since 1940, 60% of the jobs that we have now didn't exist in 1940, right? So I want to ask you, as a coordinator, as a newbie in your job, you're kind of creating the model for your job, right? Can you see other positions underneath your helm that would actually support that don't exist yet?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of like how we're outlining those future jobs in the reforestation plan,
yes.
We're going to have a goal to like develop a workforce. So I'm finding with the goals for that plan are, at first I was like, oh my goodness, like what all are we going to say the goals should be? But really a good half of them are like, get the plants, get the land, and get the people, right? So workforce development is going to be a huge part of reforestation just at the statewide level. But I think overall, as policy shifts to incorporate climate resiliency a little more, there's a lot of positions like mine that are going to be really helpful to connect specialists and operations and, academics and, the private sector for things like plant material and equipment and contracting. And all of those pieces need to come together on the same swatch of land, right? So I was presenting for university, a bunch of undergrads last week, and they were all in the biology department, and they were like, what do you want to tell, the aspiring young professionals? And I know that all these kids are really concerned about, their grade in genetics and things like that, or like in plant pathology. And I'm thinking that stuff is all really important background. You have to know enough, right, to be able to understand what, the climate scientist or the forester is telling you the problem is or what the solution is. But at the end of the day, it's like there's going to be a lot more. I think there will be a really important role sort of emerging in all aspects of policy to just get all the same people or all the right people in the same room to actually arrive at a solution and do strategic planning and decision-making and adaptive management. So yeah, and specifically for New York State, there are a few different fields, I guess, that DEC works in where we have regional coverage. So we have our regional offices, our regional foresters that do forest stewardship with, private landowners, and they'll go and sort of play tree doctor and, prescribe a forest management plan. So we have regional coverage for that. Folks might know their regional forester. There's the soil and water conservation districts have that regional coverage where they can connect with people on the landscape and provide that technical expertise. And so we're sort of thinking about, for reforestation, there might be opportunities to create some type of hubs that can operate within the region because, I'm very appreciative of my role here working in the state's capital in Albany, sort of overseeing the whole state. I know a lot about New York State, but I'm not going to be able to connect to somebody in, say, Rochester, like somebody who's worked in that region their whole life is going to be able to. So
that's really a great explanation. And the reason why we ask about people's backgrounds is because no one person gets to their position the same way. And from what I'm hearing from you is you're going to need a lot of different types of backgrounds in order to fulfill what you need to fulfill.
Yeah.
One of the things that I always would have students ask me as a professor, they'd say, what am I going to do when I get out of school? I said, don't worry about what you're going to do when you get out of school because your job has not been created yet. And they would look at me like, what are you talking about? I go, because by the time another year passes, there could be a new position that nobody's ever heard of before that is coming out and you're going to fit the bill because you have this weird background that just fits all the things that they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And they look at me and they go, oh, I get it now, but it takes a little time because if you're not thinking in that way, you can miss the boat.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I have a lot of engineers in my life. And it's, for folks who grow, or I'm sure it's the same with trade schools and things like that. You get the skills, you do the internship or whatever, you're an apprentice and then you go out and you use it. And that's your job. And, climate and environmental science and conservation is just not like that. It's moving so fast. It's this totally novel field that's opening up. You need science, you need the academia side, you need the people on the ground, and then you need the, whatever I'm doing, the facilitation. Of all the jobs that I've had, I mentioned, all the work that I've had the privilege of doing on the ground relating to the environment, and the job that I think is most similar to what I do now is giving tours on boats, and answering people's questions and describing what all is going on here.
Is that what you did on the Hudson?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, there's some environmental education and then some sort of environmentally themed, tourism opportunities on the Hudson. So no big crazy boats, but yeah, it's interesting to see the overlap there.
When my daughter got out of college and she went to an Ivy League, she wanted to work in her friend's bagel store, and people went, what? Why is she working in her friend's bagel store? She goes, you know how much I like kitchens and food and cooking and all that kind of stuff. She said, I just want to see how they run it and see how they, what people want to eat and all that kind of stuff. And people, I said, you know what? I don't ask my daughter anything. If that's what she wants to do, she's working every day. So I don't have any complaints.
Wonderful.
So when she went to work for a company that was working for the government, they wanted her because of her food background. Of all things, they wanted her because she worked in a bagel store.
That's awesome.
And she is an environmentalist, right? She's an environmentalist. And they said, and the reason why we want you because you worked in a bagel store is because we do a lot of social gatherings to meet our clients, to have socials. And that's important too. And we need somebody to coordinate that when we need somebody to coordinate it. And we don't have anybody here that does that kind of stuff. That's how she got in the door. Who would have ever guessed?
Are you originally from New York State?
Yeah, I'm from near the Albany area. And then I like to say that I have like a pretty good understanding and sense of place for like a buffer around the Hudson River and maybe the Catskills and the Adirondacks. And then, like I mentioned earlier, like I have a lot of friends from Western New York that are like, you gotta, there's more for you to learn about the southern tier in Western New York. But yeah, It's a wonderful state.
And I would think you have a rich abundance of educational institutions. Do you consider them your stakeholders like SUNY, Syracuse, and Cornell? Do you get to meet with all those great, smart people, and are they supporting you?
Yeah. Overall, like I said, I'm talking to just everybody under the sun. So we have everybody from, like some of our folks working on the ground in the Soil and Water Conservation District through state agencies. And the SUNYs the state universities in New York have a really interesting role to play in this, because not only are they fulfilling the youth engagement side, but also there's workforce development opportunities there. You can convince somebody to be a forester later in life, or arm them with sort of, the soft skills that they can later pair up with, careers in their future. And then the other thing about the SUNYs, interestingly, is that and there's a few situations like this, there are a number of them have horticultural programs or greenhouses. So we're actually looking at partnering with the SUNYs to help with propagation to scale up plant material as well, because that might be something that they're doing anyways, because they're trying to teach kids how to grow, and they're just growing something that it's more about the experience of them growing it, and then it ends up being sold as a landscape plant or something. So we have a lot of excitement coming out of the SUNYs to help with that, and just everybody's asking me about, what internships can I do? I've started meeting and, talking to some of the kids at the SUNYs that I've been able to meet. They're so excited about this. I don't know if I'm biased looking at the environmental science focused kids, but yeah, it's been a really wonderful experience. Like talking to somebody who's saying, oh yeah, like I started trying to, propagate trees, and here's how it's going, and I want to help move this statewide effort forward by doing that. I was like, oh, what class are you propagating your trees in? And this kid goes, oh, it's just in my dorm. It's like, wow. All right, we're going to be okay.
Yeah. I need to clarify. Did you say the governor said, let's get 25 million? Was that the number?
Okay. Yeah, 25 million trees by 2033.
Yeah, so for Eva and I, we've had numerous discussions with guests about seed sourcing and availability and propagation. And what's your take on, will the state be able to support it? And I'm assuming outside vendors. Mm-hmm. And I'm also wondering about, you mentioned unused, underutilized agricultural land. Does that ever become a resource for you?
Yeah. So I'll start with the sort of the nursery, the plant material procurement side of things. I should have mentioned this. This is like all I keep saying, like I eat, sleep, and breathe reforestation. So I gloss over these crucial parts. Yeah. So for New York State, we have the Saratoga Tree Nursery. It's been in operation since early 1900s. It's the oldest nursery in the state. We originally had, I think, 9 nurseries back in the 30s. If you want to get into like the history part, it's really interesting. Sure. Basically, we had a reforestation plan. I looked into this because someone said in an email, this is JJ, and she's coming up with our first New York State reforestation plan. I said, is that right? And I looked into it. We have a librarian here at DC that, dug around. And it turns out there was one, and it was about 100 years ago, almost on the nose. And we planted up, a really insane acreage for the 1930s. There was a ton of recruitment of like young, it was called the Civilian Conservation Corps. Right. CCC. Yeah. So, there was some precedent there, but that was part of the nurseries that we had cited regionally throughout the state way back then, contributed to that. And then since then, all of them closed but one. So we have the Saratoga Tree Nursery. It's definitely historic, is what I'll say. I grew up driving past it all the time. I was there last week, and it's like they do a lot of great work there. I think, crank out like 1 million seedlings a year or something like that. But as a part of 25 million trees, the governor recognized that upgrading that facility would really expand our ability to create plant material in-house. So they're hoping to modernize over the next few years. They're sort of in that planning process now, and they're going to be able to scale up to produce something like maybe closer to 6 or 8 million seedlings annually. But even that alone, back of the envelope math, that won't do it either, right? So the SUNYs are going to be, I mentioned, propagating some of our plant material. I've also had some interesting conversations with the Department of Corrections, who has a similar scenario where they have some horticultural education programs where they have greenhouses sited at the correctional facility, teaching folks how to propagate and grow plants. And I saw some, empty tables in there. I was saying, well, we could propagate some trees, and So that's some of the plant material background.
I'm wondering with some of the farmers who might be feeling like they might not feel very successful in the crops that they're growing right now, if they could be tapped for growing your trees as well. I mean, they could be grown in either raised beds or something like that on their farms, and it would still keep them on their farm and really relate to the projects that you're working with. And I think farmers are really good at supporting things that recognize not only what they do, but also what surrounds them. Yeah. When you're talking about the Saratoga nursery, they all closed because they were so successful in reforesting the state of New York. And back in the end of the 19th century, New York and Pennsylvania were like twins. They were totally stripped of all their trees because of industry. And they saw the need, the two states next to each other saw the need to open nurseries to replant their lost tree populations. And that is now back again. And you're talking about, yes, they had a forest plan. And I think that's really telling for where we are today, that we recognize that we, again, need to do what we did back then to replant and to resurface our lands. But I think the farmers are going to be the answer to a lot of states' needs for growing. Just observation, because I worked, with food crops and that when I was professor, and I really saw that they had quick strategies for different things that they wanted to grow, but they might be able to help you with what you're doing.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about, the need to integrate trees into what we would otherwise consider sort of like non-forest land uses. And that's a big one because it's in some parts of the state really tough to be a farmer because the development pressure and the taxes are insane. And so, it's not always the most cheery thing to hear, like, oh, we're going to plant up, like all of anything that we think kind of looks like ag land from aerial imagery. And I understand how, that can raise concern in farming communities. But I think it's going to be crucial to when we talk about farming being something that's, you can't, establish an entire forest on that acreage, but you can integrate trees. You can maybe integrate seed production areas where you grow trees just to produce some of those seeds, Yeah. We talk about the energy sector and we have renewable energy siting, but, we don't want to necessarily take these other land uses and pit them against reforestation. We want them to sort of, be able to arrive at a compromise where, we can get some trees in here,
Well, talking with some of the nursery people out on the West Coast, they're developing orchards to raise their seed because they have a hard time getting to the seed that they need for the production. So I could see a farmer, we need you to plant a tree orchard. That's a different story than just greening your property and getting them to provide the seed from the trees that they're growing on their property, as you mentioned. That would be a really great service for the community and the state of New York. And they would feel totally at home doing it, I'm sure.
Yeah. And the way that we're talking about this kind of reminds me of how, some folks in my Bureau of Forest Resource Management talk about timber management, because it is kind of like tree farming, just sort of internally. It's like that's the closest thing. But it's just such a different experience given the timeline of trees and humans that there's a way to do, sustainable timber management and harvests. And then you can, actually really support natural regeneration in that forest system, and you can get a crop out of it, a timber crop out of it. But it's just thought of in such a different way because, when you do that cut, then you're not going to see, corn crop up the very next year or something like that, and it's not necessarily, we don't have the same consumer relationships necessarily. It's like your average bear will go and buy tomatoes from the grocery store and make tomato sauce in their house that night. But not every person in the general public is going to understand the pipeline of lumber to coffee table necessarily. But it is, it's like a crop. And if we could take on land use and an understanding of land ownership in that way, where it's we have these resources that we can manage sustainably and we can benefit from it, sort of that commodity circle there. But again, like ecology, like I was saying before, so nuanced and so difficult to wrap your head around if you have a life. I
think that's probably where your job is going to really create some surprises for you, where you're going to be coming up with these new ideas that really have never been tested before. And people are going to be like, what? I had no idea, and it's really joyful rather than being painful, when you talk about forestry and reforestation, because that is a heavy lift when you're talking about 25 million trees.
Do you have a sense, JJ, what New York State's trajectory is for the renewables that it's going to put into place to power the state?
I really don't. So I really only know the touch points, I guess, that forestry and reforestation might have on that sector.
Right.
And so, I know that the folks that work in the energy sector are looking at, for solar panels specifically, they're looking at creating like a solar scorecard so they can prioritize, some sites over others. And the touch point that we've had for that has been at DEC has been to try to integrate trees into that, to try to get, if you're going to put acres and acres of solar panels out, try to go for the sites that don't involve forest clearing to do that first, sort of thing.
Right.
So we're just sort of keeping our finger on the pulse of that. But, I'm not 100% sure about exactly, what their trajectory is. But I understand the pressure of because for them, it's a mandate, right? The law is a mandate. For us, it's like, work on carbon sequestration, please, and everything's got to get done yesterday, right? Because it's climate. So I think they're moving full steam ahead for sure.
So I was thinking about that because there's, if you raise your solar panels high enough, you could actually do growing operations underneath them. And forest crops like partial shade. So you would be ideally situated to have your panels and then be growing your trees underneath them, your seedlings, and then cart them off and, put another crop in. And then there would be no qualms about the property being used just for one thing. It's being used for multiple things. And then I was thinking that when you were talking about reforestation, the amount of products that can come from the forest floor, like your mushrooms, all the different types of fungi and, the medicinals that come from forests and so on and so forth. It's just endless that what can come from what you're doing. It just kind of blows my mind.
What I always come back to is, that's really just getting all the right people in the same room. Like, you mentioned they're trying to find ways where renewable energy could be compatible with like propagation or with seed production areas, and then touch on agroforestry a little bit. And there's like a person, like a specialist, in my network somewhere that I can go to and say, how are we going to, I don't know myself, but how can we best integrate what you're already doing or what your mission for your organization maybe already is, what landowners you're talking to already want to do, and then try to find the overlap there. So yeah, it's just, obviously the logistics are crazy, especially when it comes to private lands. So my fun fact I share every time I talk to anybody is that 75% of New York State's forests are privately owned. So what it comes down to is really, you can have as many ideas as you can come up with, on what to do with an acre till you're blue in the face. But, when you go to the landowner, it comes down to their understanding, their objectives and their needs and funding and equipment and who's going to be doing the work on the ground. So yeah, as long as we can provide like the best recommendations on how to have all of those moving parts work together for carbon, for climate, for habitat, then we can start to communicate those things better and make those possibilities a little more achievable.
So I have a little bit of familiarity with some logging in Onondaga County. My in-laws had property, and my mother-in-law very carefully did sell off a bunch of timber, and I think it did put a nice piece of change in her pocket. I don't remember what her efforts were in terms of the reforestation. So is that you kind of boots on the ground? Do you talk to the private landowners after they sell off an acre? I think I'm remembering my mother-in-law telling me, the forester, the logger, he was very conscientious. And I actually, in all honesty, I don't remember the area being devastated, when the operation was done. But is that a role for you where you're talking to them about what to do now?
Yeah.
Best practices, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I love that question so much. So it's not me, right? But it's we do have like DEC presence there. So that's our regional foresters, probably who your relatives spoke with. There are like a couple like great talking points that I can take from that anecdote right there. One is that the key is like, you ask like when someone does a harvest, then who do you go to talk to after? And the key that's like really, again, like difficult to relay and not intuitive is, that conversation has to happen before. So there's like all these sad stories from folks I work with that, worked with landowners, and they'll call and say, I just had a cut, do you want to come take a look? And they're like, what do I do now? And they're like, this isn't, like what we would have recommended.
Yeah.
It's kind of gone now,
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm sort of new to like the world of silviculture coming out of invasive forest health, but there is this really crucial difference between just sort of colloquially the forester and the logger. I was just talking to a private company that used to be just tree care landscaping, and they sort of pivoted to ecological restoration. And I went and interviewed them recently near where I live. And they were saying they did a little analysis of like everybody else in the county that advertises tree care, forestry, or, ecological restoration. And they went through to see how many of them were certified arborists or something like that, or had some type of professional licensing. And they said that all of them said something to that effect, right? So he said that the person who was doing this analysis came up and said, yep, every single person has this. And then the owner looked at the list and said, well, I know these guys and they don't have it. He doesn't have it. He doesn't have it. And what they all said was sort of like the organic or natural flavoring type greenwashy effect
of
expert in tree care, or, or certifiably really cool or whatever. I don't know what you would say. But so there's the foresters who are going to tell you, here's the best way to manage your land so that you can continue to get reforestation, or you can continue to get regeneration, and you can do this sustainably. And then there are loggers or folks who have the interest of just extracting the timber that is going to sell the best and running with that, which everybody's got to make a living, we get it. But sometimes you'll hear called high grading. It's like just selecting for, getting the most bang for your buck. And then what's left isn't going to be, like we said, as resilient. So yeah, we're trying to really represent and do better outreach to private landowners on the importance of getting a forester or a natural resource professional before you take that action, just because like we were saying, once you do that cut, it's done. That's your grandkids' problem now.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not pleasant.
Yeah. But it's such a nuanced world that I have been working in conservation for years now, and I didn't really have an understanding of it, right? So it's you grow up with the Lorax and you're never cut anything. There you go. And that's not it's always, the joke is that a forester's favorite answer is it depends,
Well, I'd like to think that the landowners, when they're selling off some of those trees, hopefully they have some sentimental attachment, and knowing that they're saying goodbye to a woodland that maybe they walked through for decades.
Yeah.
I keep thinking that it's probably sugar maple is your primary hardwood. And, it's a spectacular tree when it's forest grown in a naturalized location. And then to your point about certified arborists, I mean, there's plenty of tree companies that have that certification, but they'll still cut down anything. The certification doesn't bring you an ethical upgrade.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good point, Hal. That's a really good point.
Tweet that for me, would you?
I love that. I love that point to relate to that.
If there's money in it, then that's kind of what's going to take precedence. And it's the same thing with, people get really upset to hear that sometimes there are these cases where, forests get cleared to put solar in, but it's that's because there's a profit to be made. It's got to happen immediately. And that's going to be the most cost effective thing. And of course, I'm saying this as somebody who does not work anywhere near that field, so I can pick on them easy. And then I get to make the joke, you can tell that we're honest because, there's not necessarily money in climate resilience. So not yet. It's coming. But
well, I think you're right about that. It's coming, and every profession has its day. Who would have guessed that computers have what they have? I mean, that's one good example. But
sure.
I think you're right about that. And the greening industry is so nuanced that there's just so much there that you have to know, especially in your position. And it's really good that you've got your ear to the ground and you're listening to all these different people and you're making the connections, because almost like you're in school all the time because you're interviewing. And it's nice because you're learning at the same time, but you're probably also teaching the people that you're talking with too. When you say, hey,
life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, lately I find I'm even uncomfortable using the word green industry because it has whiffs of gasoline and leaf blowers and chainsaws.
Yeah.
And it's repulsive.
Well, the buzzwords are so interesting because it's there's so many things to keep track of. It's people are worried about, their own health and about chemicals and materials in the environment and, worried about climate change impacts and responses to those impacts and, habitat and wildlife and everything. There's too many things to keep track of. And I think the buzzwords end up taking the headlines, and then those sort of snippets tend to be overinflated with meaning. So, I keep a count of how many people I'm talking to. And I think right now I'm at 204 stakeholders at 13 agencies and 110 organizations. It's
wow,
we're all
fantastic.
sharing. Yeah. I talk a lot. I don't stop. And it's in talking to all those people, everybody pretty much has something to bring to the table. They have some valid experience or expertise, but the way you word it can really, like some people aren't going to even like framing all of this as climate resilience or as carbon. Like some people, when they hear carbon, they hear carbon offsets, which is this crazy market that I don't understand at all.
Yeah.
But I think it makes sense to approach with a little skepticism because it's so new. And then some people might, be focused on, say, wildlife or something like that. And they might be like, oh, I've had a lot of people be worried about grassland birds and thinking, oh my God, like I've dedicated my life to creating grassland bird habitat. You're going to ruin all that? Like, no, so choosing, the way that we frame it to ensure that like we are going to take all of these different criteria into consideration to try to find the best or least bad way to make use of our land and to try to build that resilience using forests. Yeah, it's a lot of people work. You never would have thought.
Yeah.
I don't think we've ever done this in the history of the world to the extent of what you're doing. In other words, that orchestration that I was talking about, that, before it was all like segmenting everything. Now we're trying to pull it all back together again. So it's the cohesiveness that you were talking about earlier with resilience. That is what's new to the world, because once you pull the world apart and you have to put it back together again, you better be pretty darn good at what you do in order to put it back together and make the right things fit. Because, you're talking about riparian areas, you're talking about clean water, you're talking about animal habitat, and I could go on and on and on. But that is all about the knowledge that you gained by being in the field and looking at those invasive plants or that forest that you walked with and hiked in with your colleagues, that you saw things that they may not have seen, or maybe they saw things that you didn't see because you're coming from a different angle. Those are the kind of things I think about. And again, it's never been done before because it's so new, because we had to wait till everything fell apart in order to put it back together. That's where we're at now. I think it can be scary, but as you were mentioning, you just have to start moving. You just start doing and see where it takes you. Because once you start, then momentum starts too.
Yeah, and believing that you can have an impact, and some of that is recognizing the negative impact, right? I feel like we're kind of hammered with humans are bad for the environment, almost is like how it can feel sometimes. But you can also have an impact positively. And when we're all globally connected like this, then it can feel like the environment is somewhere over there, that you have to like get in your car and drive to the trailhead and then you're in the environment. I mean, not to gripe about invasives, but I came out of the landscape industry as like a teenager and I learned all the plants in the greenhouse, the whole inventory. And then I was like, oh, and now I have like an ecology type job. It's going to be all new plants. I'm not going to know any of them. It's all the same plants. And I had been planting them, for my job a month before I got hired. I went, oh my God, because it's the same environment, So it's like your positive actions are going to have an impact locally. Your negative actions are going to have an impact. Like the environment's not separate from you. It's really about building that connection back, because the state of, I guess, our culture right now can feel kind of disconnected.
As we should know, and we don't, is that we are not the superior beings on the planet. It's us who are going to make the planet better by reorchestrating what we destroyed and helping all the other creatures that are here. And that's what we're actually doing when we recreate forest and what we recreate in the oceans, for example, with the bags of oyster shells that we're putting along the banks so that the oysters can rehabilitate the areas. I mean, those are all the things that you think about, and maybe not everybody thinks about those, but those are the things I think about when I'm laying in bed at night. And, what's the next big thing coming down the pike,
Yeah.
And what's the next big thing JJ's going to be doing?
Only time will tell. What did I know?
In terms of agroforestry, is anyone doing anything with the nut industry? Does anyone grow pecans or hickories or whatever and take them to market? Is that a thing in New York State?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And there's such a thing as, and I'm talking way out of my wheelhouse, but there's such a thing as the Northern Nut Growers Association.
Okay.
I believe they've been made aware of the reforestation effort. I sent something for somebody's PowerPoint on that. Our New York State Department of Agriculture has a really good read on nut production and is thus pretty excited about the prospect of agroforestry. And then we just have like a lot of enthusiasm around agroforestry, I would say, in the state. So the Cornell Cooperative Extensions have a few different, there's a program called Cornell Small Farms that works a little bit with agroforestry. I was just visiting a site near where I live that's a Cornell Cooperative Extension in Columbia Green Maine counties. They have a Siusla model forest where they've done some agroforestry sort of like demos. Yeah. So I know nuts are difficult especially because what we all want to grow the most in New York State, it seems, is the American chestnut, which has its issues such as blight, which continues and persists. But there's even some really good work going on there in, using hybridized versions and things like that. So again, speaking a little bit out of my expertise, but I'm just getting so much enthusiasm from the agroforestry community that, I think it's going to be, maybe that's your next big thing, Eva. Like,
I agree.
I totally agree.
It is a fun concept.
Yeah. What was the lady's name that we interviewed who lives down in Virginia who has Eliza. Yeah. She has a woodland that she raises her pigs in. And she sells her pigs for a really high price because they're charcuterie pigs. Yeah, that's what they are.
Acorns and stuff, right? Wow.
Whether it's acorns or whatever other kind of nuts she's growing in there. And she says it's just amazing. But she also puts her chickens in there too because they can eat the mulberry leaves. And the mulberry leaves are such a really good source of nutrients for chickens. And we just learned so much from that. And she's one person, but just think if you multiplied her by thousands, how the world can change just by having that kind of agroforestry.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to human impact. There are people out there that know this stuff and know best how to create this sort of like circular self-sustaining system where you can manage the forest and you can have it be a resource for timber, for food crops of some kind, for all the ecosystem services that it provides. And I always say, like, every time that some plan, broaches this as like a novel idea, like Indigenous people have probably already been doing it for ages and ages or something like that. Yeah. And there's, a lot of academia that's focused on those sort of the circularity of sustainability and all those overlapping land uses. So it's possible. And just...
Yeah. We had another great guest too. That was the gentleman from Vermont, Mark Krawcheck.
Oh, yes.
He wrote that book, Coppice Agroforestry, Tending Trees for Profit, Product, and Woodland Ecology.
That sounds great.
And that makes me think that a coppice woodland could coexist with a solar farm.
Yeah.
Or
a farmer.
This is why I love my job.
Yeah.
That's why we love our job.
Yeah.
Talking with people like you.
He was great. JJ, feel free to chase his book down because he was a visionary.
Yeah, a definite visionary. So tell us, you could talk about this moment, but maybe go back to your childhood. What kind of trees are you like crazy about?
Oh, the favorite tree question.
Yeah, the favorite tree question. But we don't want to have to limit you to one if you have more than one.
Right. Well, it's actually, coming out of invasives, you become fond of the trees that are like not doing so hot. So the eastern hemlock that's under the pressure of the hemlock woolly adelgid. There's, an ash that has a ton of cultural significance, and emerald ash borer, and, the dualities. And there's beech, huge fan of beech, but we got beech leaf disease going after beech. So, and like I said, I grew up not really understanding as right, you said, like childhood, like I'm from an area that doesn't have a great ecosystem going on, right? I had like quarter acre in the backyard right up against the Adirondack Northway. There was like a gross like culvert, of like gross water coming out and like whatever weedy shrubs. And I was like, wow, this is nature. I'm a child, And then, going back there, I'm like, oh my God, this area was like, it was a brownfield. It was like former ag land, all this stuff. But I learned every plant in there. And then I knew all the plants I needed to know to do invasive species as well. So it's like, I saw this is a tree, and as it is, it's fine. So I didn't play favorites. But what I usually do say is I think white oak is a great one. Oak just supports an insane diversity of life. There's actually a book specifically about oaks. It's a Doug Tallamy book. He does a bunch of invasive versus native species stuff, and it's like one tree can do all this. And then white oak is historically has sort of an interesting role in New York State because this is a super wild card. Of my many jobs that I had, I at one point worked in a cooperage, which means you make barrels.
Sure, for barrels. Absolutely.
And barrels have to be made out of white oak in order to hold liquid. Yeah. And in order for it to, I think, legally be considered American whiskey, it has to be aged in a white oak barrel that's been aged a certain amount of time. So looking at white oak, that's an amazing species in terms of like where it grows, what it does, life it supports. And then it's just such a bizarre commodity and has that crazy history. And so white oak's a good one.
The King of England had some of his best oak forests in New York cordoned off to build his ships. And so, a lot of people don't know that, but there were special areas in our colonies that were critical for how the British became the big Royal Navy that they were. And it was because of this colony, the United States, that actually made them the biggest fleet in the world. And it was because of our trees. And people said they never saw anything as big as what they saw here. And the oaks, there was a cooperage right behind not too far from where my grandmother lived. So I'm totally get where you're coming from. And we used to watch the guys make the barrels. It was so cool. It was just amazing. Yeah. But white oak was critical for making ships.
Well, I guess the follow-up question for JJ would be, what's your favorite invasive?
Yeah.
Have you made peace with anything?
The one that I love to hate. Yeah. And that is spotted lanternfly.
Oh, Atlantis.
Yeah. So spotted lanternfly goes after tree of heaven, which is already super widespread. Tree of heaven actually was distributed by the USDA. This is a great shade tree. A tree grows in Brooklyn is about tree of heaven. So we have tree of heaven everywhere,
Yeah.
And then spotted lanternfly comes along and targets for that, but it also feeds on tons and tons and tons of agricultural crops and forest species. It's just this generalist. And it's the reason I've come to terms with loving it. I did my whole master's thesis on spotted lanternfly. I was spotted lanternfly for Halloween last year. It was great. So some people are worrying about me over here at the agency, but what's great about it is that it's just objectively gross. It swarms. You got to squish it. It hops around it excretes gross, sticky honey. It's just objectively the biblical image of we don't want this, And that's really a ton of forest pests and forest health issues in general and climate change issues in general. So if you can get somebody to be this is really gross and we hate this, then maybe that could be your edge. And so the thing, the way to get ahead of this is to practice good forest management and land stewardship and things like that. I think it connects people.
And there's so many young children who know about it too, which is really fun. They look for those black little bugs with the red spots, or is it the red little bugs with the black spots? I think it's the black with the red spots.
They have a few different instars, which makes it harder. They look different throughout their life. But you can get people that don't care about that stuff. I remember my father calling me and I told him all about all this stuff, okay, my kid is into bugs, whatever. And he calls me and he's like, oh my God, I just found one of your bugs. And I'm like,
your
okay.
Bugs. Your bugs.
Yeah. And he's like, AJ, this is real. And I'm like, yeah, and all of a sudden it wasn't like I said, it's not like the environment is happening over there. And it's something that my kid does for work. And that's just and I'm going to go back and think about it's no, it's happening to all of us. All these environmental changes are going to be things that we experience and live.
Yeah.
Spotted lanternfly.
What a great guest you've been. We've really enjoyed chatting with you and learning so much about what you're doing. And wow, it's great.
We don't have, I guess we can't take credit for getting any stems in the ground yet, but, it's not going to come from me. It's not going to come from DEC. It's going to come from just everybody in New York State pitching in, deciding to get into tree planting, get into land stewardship, whatever. So,
well, I think you also have to have the enthusiasm to get them to do it. So you're creating the buzz right now. Once the buzz really starts, everybody's going to hop on, or should I say fly on?
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's been great. Thank you so much for joining us, JJ.
Yeah, it was great to meet you both.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
If you plant a tree, tell me.
The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromeda Recordings in Hollywood, California. Thank you.